When wealthy rancher Harrison Caldwell pretends to sleep in his study to secretly observe his shy maid Catherine, he expects to catch her stealing or snooping through his private belongings. Instead, he discovers her tender care during a blizzard and her heartfelt conversations with his sleeping form, revelations that will force him to choose between a profitable marriage and the woman who unknowingly captured his guarded heart. But what will Catherine do when she discovers his deception has been listening to her most private thoughts all along? The crackling fire in Harrison Caldwell's study suddenly popped, sending sparks up the chimney as he slumped deeper into his leather chair, pretending to be fast asleep. Outside the massive ranch house windows, the Wyoming Territory stretched endlessly under the star-filled sky of 1879, but Harrison's attention focused entirely on the soft footsteps approaching his door. At 32 years old, Harrison owned the largest cattle ranch within 200 miles of Cheyenne. His riverside ranch sprawled across thousands of acres, employing over 40 cowboys and ranch hands. Gold coins filled his pockets, and his name carried weight in every bank from Denver to San Francisco. Yet tonight, like so many nights before, he found himself more interested in the quiet young woman who cleaned his study than in all his vast wealth. The heavy oak door creaked open, and Catherine Morrison stepped inside, carrying a wooden bucket filled with cleaning supplies. Her brown dress, patched at the elbows but clean and pressed, rustled softly as she moved. Auburn hair pulled back in a simple braid caught the firelight, and her green eyes swept the room with careful attention to every detail. Harrison had been watching Catherine for 3 months now. Ever since she'd arrived at the ranch looking for work. She'd come from Ohio after her father died, leaving her with nothing but the clothes on her back and a letter of recommendation from their old family doctor. Most ranch owners wouldn't hire a young woman to work inside their house, but Harrison's cook, Mrs. Rodriguez, had taken one look at Catherine's honest face and insisted they give her a chance. "She's got good hands for cleaning," Mrs. Rodriguez had told Harrison, "and she don't talk too much like some girls do." Now, as Harrison watched through barely open eyes, he wondered what secrets lay behind Catherine's quiet manner. She moved through his study like a ghost, dusting his books and papers with gentle care. Her fingers traced the leather spines of his favorite novels, and she always made sure to leave his reading glasses exactly where he'd placed them on the side table. Tonight felt different, though. Catherine paused at his massive oak desk, looking down at the papers scattered across its surface. Harrison held his breath, wondering if she would finally give in to curiosity and read his private business letters. Many people in town whispered about his wealth, speculating about his deals and partnerships. Would Catherine prove to be like all the others, hungry for information about his money? Instead, she carefully lifted each paper, dusted beneath it, and placed it back in exactly the same position. Her movements were so precise that Harrison doubted he would notice anything had been touched when he woke up in the morning. "There you go, Mr. Caldwell's important papers," she whispered to herself. "All clean and tidy for tomorrow's business." Harrison's eyebrows nearly shot up in surprise. Catherine was talking to herself, or perhaps to him, thinking he was fast asleep. Her voice carried a warmth he'd never heard during their brief daytime encounters, when she would curtsy quickly and scurry away whenever he entered a room. Catherine moved to the tall bookshelf that covered one entire wall of the study. As she reached for a leather-bound volume of Shakespeare, she began to hum a soft melody. The tune was unfamiliar to Harrison, but something about it reminded him of lazy summer afternoons from his childhood, when his mother would sing while hanging laundry on the line behind their small farmhouse. "Mama used to sing that song," Catherine murmured, still thinking Harrison was asleep. "She said music made work feel lighter, made time pass sweeter." She pulled the book down and opened it carefully, running her finger along the pages. Harrison realized with a start that Catherine could read, something not every ranch worker could claim. Most of the cowboys he employed could barely sign their own names, but here was Catherine, silently mouthing words from one of his favorite plays. "Love looks not with the eyes, but with the mind," she quoted softly, then closed the book with a gentle sigh. "I wonder if that's really true." The wistful tone in her voice made Harrison's chest tighten unexpectedly. He found himself wanting to sit up and ask her what she meant, to have a real conversation with this mysterious young woman who cleaned his house by day and revealed her thoughts by night. Catherine finished dusting the bookshelf and moved toward the fireplace, where Harrison's favorite portrait hung above the mantel. The painting showed his prize stallion, Thunder, galloping across the open range with his black mane flowing in the wind. Harrison had commissioned the artwork 2 years ago from a traveling artist, paying more for it than most people earned in a year. "You're a beautiful horse," Catherine said to the painting, as if Thunder could hear her. "I bet you run like the wind itself. I used to have a horse back in Ohio, just a little mare named Buttercup. She wasn't fast or fancy, but she was mine." Harrison watched as Catherine's hand reached toward the painting, then stopped just short of touching it. Her expression grew sad, and he found himself wondering what had happened to her horse, to her old life in Ohio, to the family she'd left behind. The grandfather clock in the corner chimed 10 times, and Catherine glanced toward Harrison's sleeping form. She walked closer to his chair, and Harrison had to concentrate hard on keeping his breathing steady and his eyes closed. "You work too hard, Mr. Caldwell," she said quietly. "Mrs. Rodriguez says you're out checking cattle from dawn until dark, barely stopping to eat. That ain't healthy for a man, no matter how much land he owns." Harrison felt Catherine's presence beside his chair, close enough that he could smell the faint scent of lavender soap on her skin. For a moment, he thought she might reach out and touch his shoulder, maybe shake him awake and suggest he go to his proper bed upstairs. Instead, she reached for the quilt draped over the back of his chair, a patchwork creation his mother had made years ago. Catherine unfolded it carefully and laid it across Harrison's legs, tucking it gently around his boots. "There," she whispered. "Can't have you catching cold in your own house." The simple kindness of the gesture hit Harrison like a physical blow. When was the last time someone had taken care of him without expecting something in return? His business partners wanted his money. The women in town wanted his name and status. Even his own ranch hands, loyal as they were, worked for him because he paid their wages. But Catherine had covered him with a blanket, simply because she thought he might be cold. As she gathered her cleaning supplies and prepared to leave, Catherine paused at the door and looked back at Harrison's sleeping figure. "Sweet dreams, Mr. Caldwell," she said softly. "I hope tomorrow brings you something to smile about." The door closed behind her with barely a sound, leaving Harrison alone with the crackling fire and a dozen new questions swirling in his mind. Who was this woman who moved through his house like a gentle spirit? What dreams did she carry in her heart? And why did her simple kindness affect him so deeply? Harrison opened his eyes and stared at the ceiling, knowing sleep would elude him for hours to come. For the first time in 3 years, since tragedy had hardened his heart and narrowed his world to nothing but work and wealth, he found himself curious about another person's story. Tomorrow night, he decided, he would pretend to sleep again. And maybe, if he was patient enough, Catherine Morrison would reveal more of the mystery that surrounded her like morning mist on the range. But first, he had to make it through an entire day of pretending he knew nothing about her midnight confessions, her gentle care, or the way she'd looked at his portrait with such longing in her eyes. What other secrets would Catherine share with his sleeping form, and could Harrison's carefully guarded heart survive the discovery? Thunder's hooves pounded against the frozen ground as Harrison rode hard toward the ranch house, his breath forming white clouds in the bitter November air of 1879. The cattle in the north pasture had broken through a fence during the night's blizzard, and he'd spent 14 hours in the saddle rounding up strays in weather cold enough to freeze a man's bones solid. His hands, even inside thick leather gloves, had gone numb hours ago, and ice crystals clung to his mustache and eyebrows. Every muscle in his body ached from fighting the wind and snow, but Harrison pushed Thunder harder, desperate to reach the warmth of his study and the leather chair where he could rest his weary bones. More than rest, though. He looked forward to Catherine's evening visit. For 2 weeks now, he'd been pretending to sleep in his chair, listening to her gentle voice and watching her move through his private space with such careful respect. Each night brought new revelations about the mysterious woman who'd captured his attention so completely. Last Tuesday, she'd found a bird with a broken wing outside his window and spent 20 minutes creating a small nest for it in a wooden box, whispering promises that everything would heal in time. Thursday night, she'd discovered his collection of adventure novels, hidden behind the serious business books, and he'd watched her eyes light up as she read passages from a story about pirates and buried treasure. "I always wanted to see the ocean," she'd confided to his sleeping form. "Mama said it was like a blue carpet stretching all the way to heaven, with waves that sang lullabies to the fish." Each confession drew Harrison deeper into fascination with Catherine's inner world. She spoke of dreams and memories, of hopes and fears, treating his unconscious presence like a trusted friend who would never judge her for wanting things beyond her reach. Tonight, however, Harrison's grand plan nearly failed before it began. As he stumbled through the front door of his ranch house, his legs gave way and he collapsed into the nearest chair, which happened to be in the entrance hall rather than his study. Mrs. Rodriguez found him there 20 minutes later, his face gray with exhaustion, and his clothes soaked through with melted snow. "Mother of God! Mr. Harrison!" she exclaimed, rushing to his side. "You look like death walking. Catherine! Catherine, come quick!" Harrison tried to protest that he was fine, just tired, but his tongue felt thick and clumsy in his mouth. The warmth of the house after so many hours in the freezing wind had left him dizzy and confused. Catherine appeared at the top of the stairs, still wearing her nightgown and wrapper, her long auburn hair flowing loose around her shoulders instead of pinned back in its usual braid. Harrison had never seen her with her hair down before, and even through his exhaustion, he noticed how the firelight caught the copper highlights and made her look like something from a fairy tale. "What happened?" Catherine asked, hurrying down the stairs without thought for proper appearances. "Found him collapsed in the hall," Mrs. Rodriguez explained. "Been out in that devil storm all day looking for cattle. Probably hasn't eaten since breakfast, if then." Catherine knelt beside Harrison's chair, her green eyes filled with concern as she studied his face. Her hand reached toward his forehead, then stopped as she remembered her place in the household. "Mr. Caldwell," she said formally, "you should get out of those wet clothes before you catch pneumonia." Harrison tried to stand, but his legs refused to support him properly. The combination of cold, exhaustion, and hunger had drained every bit of strength from his powerful frame. "I can make it to my study," he mumbled, though even he doubted the truth of those words. Catherine exchanged a worried look with Mrs. Rodriguez, then made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. "Mrs. Rodriguez, could you heat some soup and coffee? Strong coffee." She turned back to Harrison, her voice gentle but firm. "Mr. Caldwell, you're going to let us help you, whether your pride likes it or not." Before Harrison could object, Catherine had pulled one of his arms across her shoulders and was helping him stand. Despite her small frame, she proved surprisingly strong, supporting his weight as they made their slow way down the hall toward his study. "Stubborn men," she muttered under her breath, thinking he was too exhausted to hear her clearly, always pushing themselves past what's healthy, then acting surprised when their bodies give out. Harrison found himself almost smiling, despite his condition. This was a side of Catherine he'd never seen before, decisive and unafraid to take charge when the situation called for it. She helped him settle into his usual leather chair, then knelt in front of the fireplace to build up the flames. Harrison watched her work, noting the efficient way she arranged the logs and the careful attention she paid to creating the perfect balance of heat and light. "There," she said, dusting off her hands as the fire began to crackle properly. "That should warm you up." Mrs. Rodriguez arrived with a tray containing a bowl of beef stew, fresh bread, and a steaming cup of coffee that smelled strong enough to wake the dead. Catherine took the tray and set it on the small table beside Harrison's chair. "Now eat," she commanded, holding out the spoon. "Every bite, Mr. Caldwell. You can't run a ranch if you don't take care of yourself." Harrison took the spoon, but his hands were shaking so badly from cold and fatigue that he nearly dropped it. Without hesitation, Catherine reached out and steadied his grip, her warm fingers covering his frozen ones. "Here, let me help," she said, guiding the spoon to his mouth. Under normal circumstances, Harrison would have been mortified to have anyone feed him like a child. His pride would never have allowed such assistance, especially from an employee. But tonight, with exhaustion clouding his judgment, and Catherine's gentle care surrounding him like a warm blanket, he found himself accepting her help with gratitude. "The soup is delicious," he managed between spoonfuls. "Mrs. Rodriguez makes the best beef stew in Wyoming territory," Catherine replied, continuing to help guide his shaking hands. "She uses a secret blend of spices her grandmother taught her back in Mexico." As Harrison ate, Catherine kept up a steady stream of quiet conversation, telling him about her day, about the new foal born in the stable that morning, about the way the snow had transformed the landscape into something magical and beautiful. "I know you probably think I'm talking too much," she said, refilling his coffee cup. "But Mama always said conversation helped healing along, kept a person's mind from dwelling on discomfort." Harrison wanted to tell her that he loved listening to her voice, that her gentle chatter was more soothing than any medicine. But admitting such a thing would reveal that he'd been awake during all those previous nights, listening to her private thoughts and confessions. Instead, he simply nodded and continued eating, letting her words wash over him like a healing balm. When the bowl was empty and the coffee finished, Catherine helped Harrison remove his wet boots and socks, replacing them with warm, dry ones from the chest near the fireplace. Her touch was completely professional, but Harrison found himself noticing the careful way she handled even this simple task, as if his comfort and well-being truly mattered to her. "You should sleep now," she said, pulling his mother's quilt up to his chin. "Real sleep. In your bed, upstairs." Harrison knew she was right, but his body felt too heavy to move, and the warmth of the fire combined with his full stomach was already pulling him toward unconsciousness. "Just few minutes," he mumbled, his eyes closing despite his efforts to stay awake. Catherine smiled softly, though Harrison couldn't see it with his eyes closed. She remained beside his chair for several minutes, watching the rise and fall of his chest, making sure his breathing stayed steady and strong. "You scared us tonight, Mr. Caldwell," she whispered, thinking he was already asleep. "Mrs. Rodriguez and me, we were so worried when we saw you collapse like that. I know it's not my place to care about what happens to you, but I do care, more than I should." Her confession hung in the air like smoke from the fireplace, and Harrison had to concentrate hard on keeping his breathing even and his expression relaxed. Here was Catherine, revealing her feelings while she believed him unconscious, just as she had during all those previous nights. "I keep telling myself it's foolish," she continued, her voice barely audible above the crackling flames. "You're Harrison Caldwell, owner of the biggest ranch in the territory, and I'm just Catherine Morrison from Ohio. Nobody special at all. But when I saw you so weak and cold tonight, all I wanted was to take care of you, to make sure you were safe and warm." She reached out and gently brushed a lock of dark hair away from Harrison's forehead, her touch as light as butterfly wings. "Sweet dreams, Mr. Harrison," she whispered. "Dream of green pastures and healthy cattle, and maybe someone who cares about you just for who you are, not for what you own." Harrison heard her footsteps moving away, heard the soft click of the door closing behind her. Only then did he open his eyes and stare into the dancing flames of the fireplace. Catherine Morrison cared about him, the man, not Harrison Caldwell, the wealthy rancher. She'd revealed her feelings while believing him helpless and unconscious, showing him a truth he might never have discovered otherwise. But what would happen when she learned about his deception? And would her caring survive the revelation that he'd been awake through all her midnight confessions? Harrison's heart nearly jumped out of his chest, when Catherine walked into his study carrying a steaming cup of coffee at exactly 9 o'clock that Tuesday evening. He had been fake sleeping for 2 weeks now, but tonight something felt different about the way she moved around his desk. "Mr. Caldwell looks so tired lately," she whispered to herself, setting the coffee down where he could reach it when he woke up. "Cook says he hasn't been eating much either." Through his barely open eyes, Harrison watched her dust his bookshelf with extra care. She picked up each book, wiped it clean, and put it back in exactly the right spot. Most of his ranch hands just shoved things around without thinking, but Catherine treated his belongings like they were made of gold. "These books must have cost a fortune," she said softly, running her finger along the leather covers. "Back home in Ohio, we only had 3 books: the Bible, a cookbook, and Pa's farming guide. I used to read them over and over until I knew every word by heart." Harrison wanted to tell her she could read any book she wanted. He owned more books than he could read in 10 lifetimes. But he stayed perfectly still, breathing slowly like a sleeping man. Catherine moved to the window and looked out at the dark prairie. The October wind rattled the glass, and she shivered in her thin dress. "Winter's coming early this year," she said. "The old-timers in town are saying it's going to be a hard one. I hope the cattle will be all right. Mr. Caldwell works so hard to take care of everything on this ranch." She turned back toward his chair, and Harrison had to fight not to open his eyes all the way. Catherine was looking right at him, with an expression he had never seen before. It was gentle and caring, like the way a mother might look at a sleeping child. "You carry too much on your shoulders," she whispered, so quietly he almost missed it. "A person can't do everything alone forever." Then she did something that made Harrison's fake sleep almost impossible to maintain. Catherine reached out and very gently straightened the blanket that had slipped from his lap. Her fingers barely touched his hand, but even that small contact sent electricity shooting up his arm. "There," she said with satisfaction. "That's better." But the real shock came when she walked to his desk and picked up the letter he had left there. Harrison's eyes snapped open just a tiny bit more. That letter was from the bank in Denver, about a loan that was coming due. It contained private information about his finances that no servant should see. Instead of reading it, Catherine carefully moved the letter to a spot where the morning sun wouldn't fade the ink. Then she placed a paperweight on top so it wouldn't blow away if someone opened a window. "Important papers shouldn't get ruined," she said to herself. Ma always said a man's business documents are like his promises written down. Harrison felt something twist in his chest. Here was a woman who could have easily read his private mail, could have learned secrets that might benefit her somehow. But instead, she was protecting his papers from harm. When was the last time someone had looked out for his interests without expecting something in return? Catherine picked up her cleaning supplies and headed toward the door, but she stopped and looked back at him one more time. "Sleep well, Mr. Caldwell," she said softly. "Tomorrow will bring whatever it brings, but tonight, you can rest." After she left, Harrison sat in the darkness for a long time, thinking about what he had just witnessed. Catherine wasn't just a maid doing her job. She was someone who genuinely cared about his well-being, someone who noticed when he was tired or worried, someone who went out of her way to make his life a little bit easier. The coffee she had brought was still warm and perfectly sweetened, just the way he liked it. As he sipped it, Harrison realized he was looking forward to tomorrow evening in a way he hadn't looked forward to anything in years. What would Catherine do next? What would she say when she thought no one could hear her? For the first time since his wife and son had died, Harrison Caldwell felt curious about another human being, and that curiosity was growing stronger every night. The next evening, Harrison settled into his chair, earlier than usual. He wanted to be ready when Catherine arrived. But when 9 o'clock came and went with no sign of her, worry started gnawing at his stomach. At 9:30, she finally appeared in the doorway, but something was wrong. She moved slowly, like every step hurt, and she kept one hand pressed against her side. "Sorry I'm late, sir," she whispered to his sleeping form. "Had a little trouble with Jake Peterson down at the bunkhouse." Harrison's eyes flew open despite his best efforts to keep them closed. Jake Peterson was the newest ranch hand, a drifter they had hired last month. He was big and mean, and had already caused trouble with 2 other workers. Catherine began dusting, but Harrison could see she was favoring her left side. When she reached up to clean the top shelf, she winced and had to stop. "That man's got hands like a bear and a temper to match," she muttered under her breath. "Ma always said to stay away from men who push people around, but sometimes you can't avoid them." Harrison's hands clenched into fists under his blanket. If Peterson had laid one finger on Catherine, there would be consequences. But he couldn't reveal that he was awake without admitting to weeks of deception. Catherine sat down heavily in the chair across from his, something she had never done before. She buried her face in her hands and took several deep breaths. "I don't know what to do," she said quietly. "He says if I tell Mr. Caldwell about tonight, he'll make sure I lose my job. Says Mr. Caldwell would never believe a nobody like me over one of his ranch hands." She looked up at Harrison's sleeping form with such sadness in her eyes that he wanted to jump up and hold her. "Maybe he's right," she continued. "Maybe I am just a nobody, but I've got to work somewhere, and jobs for women are scarce out here. If I lose this position, I'll have to go back to Ohio with my tail between my legs." Harrison had heard enough. Tomorrow he would fire Peterson and make sure the man never worked on another ranch in Wyoming territory. But tonight, he needed to find a way to let Catherine know she was safe without revealing his secret. As if reading his mind, Catherine stood up and walked over to his chair. She looked down at him with those kind eyes, and Harrison felt his heart skip several beats. "You know what, Mr. Caldwell?" she said softly. "Even if you can't hear me, it helps to talk to someone. You've got an honest face, even when you're sleeping. Ma used to say you could tell a person's character by looking at them when they thought nobody was watching." She reached out, like she might touch his face, then pulled her hand back. "I bet if you knew what happened tonight, you'd set things right. You seem like the kind of man who protects people who can't protect themselves." Then Catherine did something that nearly made Harrison forget all about his pretend sleep. She leaned down and very gently kissed his forehead, the way a sister might kiss a brother or a mother might kiss a child. "Thank you for listening," she whispered, "even if you don't know you're doing it." The blizzard hit Wyoming territory like a freight train made of ice and fury, turning the world white and deadly in the time it takes to saddle a horse. Harrison had been checking the north pasture when the first snowflakes started falling. But within an hour, those gentle flakes had become a wall of wind and snow that made it impossible to see 3 feet ahead. His horse stumbled through drifts that grew deeper with every step, and Harrison's hands were so cold he could barely hold the reins. By the time he reached the ranch house, his feet were blocks of ice in his boots, and his face felt like someone had been slapping it with frozen leather. Harrison stumbled through the front door and collapsed into his study chair, without even removing his coat. The warmth from the fireplace hit his frozen skin like tiny needles, and exhaustion pulled him down into real sleep before he could think about pretending. He woke up hours later to find Catherine kneeling beside his chair, carefully pulling off his ice-covered boots. Her face was tight with worry, and she worked with the focused attention of someone who had seen frostbite before. "Easy now," she whispered, though Harrison hadn't moved. "I know it hurts, but we have to get these boots off before your feet swell up." Harrison wanted to tell her he was awake, but something about the gentle way she was caring for him made him stay silent. Through half-closed eyes, he watched her examine his feet with the expertise of someone who had grown up on a farm where winter injuries were common. "Not too bad," she said to herself. "White around the edges, but the toes are still pink. That's good. That's very good." She disappeared for a few minutes and came back with a basin of warm water and several soft towels. Catherine tested the water temperature with her elbow, the way mothers test bath water for babies. "This might sting a little at first," she told his sleeping form, "but warm water is the best medicine for frozen feet. Pa got frostbite every winter, and Ma always said the key was to warm things up, slow and steady. She lowered his feet into the water, and Harrison had to bite his tongue to keep from groaning out loud. The warmth felt like fire against his frozen skin, but Catherine's gentle hands kept massaging his ankles and calves, working the blood back into places where it had stopped flowing. "You scared me tonight, Mr. Caldwell," she said quietly. "When you didn't come home by dark, I kept watching the windows for your horse. Cook said not to worry, that you knew these lands better than anyone, but I couldn't help myself." She lifted one of his feet out of the water and began drying it carefully with a soft towel. Her touch was so gentle that Harrison barely felt it, but the warmth spread up his leg like liquid sunshine. "I keep thinking about what would happen if something happened to you," Catherine continued. "Not just to me and my job, but to all the people who depend on this ranch. You're the heart of this place, whether you know it or not." Harrison felt something crack open in his chest that had been frozen solid for 3 years. When was the last time someone had worried about him just because they cared, not because they wanted something from him? Catherine wrapped his feet in warm towels and then did something that nearly made Harrison forget all about his pretend sleep. She pulled a quilt from the settee and tucked it around his shoulders like he was a child who needed protecting. "There," she said with satisfaction. "That should help you stay warm while you sleep." But she didn't leave. Instead, Catherine sat down in the chair across from him and watched the fire burn in the fireplace. The orange light danced across her face, and Harrison could see worry lines around her eyes that hadn't been there when she first arrived at the ranch. "I've been thinking about what Jake Peterson said last night," she said finally. "About being a nobody. Maybe he's right. Maybe I don't matter much in the grand scheme of things. But watching you sleep here tonight, taking care of you the way I'd take care of anyone who needed help, I realized something important." She turned to look at him, and Harrison had to work hard to keep his breathing slow and steady. "It doesn't matter if I'm important to the world," Catherine said. "What matters is that I can be important to one person, even if it's just for a little while, even if that person doesn't know how much they mean to me." Harrison's heart was pounding so hard he was sure she would hear it. Catherine stood up and walked over to his chair. She looked down at him with such tenderness that he wanted to open his eyes and tell her everything he was feeling. Instead, she reached out and brushed a strand of hair away from his forehead. Her fingers were soft and warm against his skin. "Sleep well, Harrison Caldwell," she whispered, using his first name for the very first time. "Tomorrow will bring whatever it brings, but tonight you're safe and warm and cared for. That's enough for now." After she left, Harrison sat in the darkness, listening to the wind howl outside and thinking about the woman who had just saved his feet from frostbite and maybe his heart from freezing solid forever. Catherine Morrison wasn't nobody. She was somebody very special, and he was starting to understand that he might be falling in love with her. But loving someone and being able to do something about it were two very different things, especially when that someone thought you were nothing more than her sleeping boss who didn't even know she existed. The storm raged outside for 3 more days, trapping everyone inside the ranch house. And for 3 more days, Catherine took care of Harrison's frostbitten feet with the same gentle attention she had shown that first night. She never asked for thanks or recognition. She just did what needed doing, because it was the right thing to do. By the time the storm cleared and Harrison could walk normally again, he knew 3 things for certain. Catherine Morrison had the kindest heart he had ever encountered. She was falling in love with a man she thought was asleep, and he was going to have to figure out how to tell her the truth without breaking both their hearts in the process. The sound of expensive carriage wheels crunching over frozen ground shattered the morning quiet like breaking glass. Harrison jerked awake in his chair, realizing he had actually fallen asleep this time, and peered through the frost-covered window to see a gleaming black coach pulling up to his front door. His heart sank as he recognized the Gold family crest painted on the side. The Ashfords had arrived from Denver 3 days earlier than expected. Victoria Ashford stepped down from the carriage like a queen descending from her throne, her emerald silk dress somehow spotless, despite the long journey across the Wyoming territory. Behind her came her father, Cornelius Ashford, whose silver mustache and cold eyes had struck fear into Denver businessmen for over 20 years. Harrison had been expecting this visit, dreading it, and now it was here whether he was ready or not. "Harrison, darling!" Victoria's voice rang out across the yard, sweet as poisoned honey. She glided toward the house, while servants unloaded trunk after trunk from the carriage. "I simply couldn't wait another moment to see you. Daddy has the most wonderful news about our future together." Through the kitchen window, Harrison caught a glimpse of Catherine dropping a plate. The crash echoed through the house, followed by Cookie's gruff voice scolding her for being clumsy. But Harrison knew better. Catherine had heard Victoria's voice, had seen the fancy carriage, and understood exactly what it meant. Within minutes, Victoria had swept into his study like a summer storm, bringing with her the scent of expensive perfume and the weight of family expectations. She settled herself into the very chair where Catherine worked each evening, arranging her skirts with practiced grace, while her sharp eyes took in every detail of the room. "My goodness, Harrison, this place could certainly use a woman's touch," she declared, running one gloved finger along the edge of his desk. "When we're married, I'll have the most wonderful ideas for redecorating. Perhaps some lovely wallpaper from Paris, and definitely better furniture. This rustic style is so primitive." Harrison's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, Cornelius Ashford entered the room with the confidence of a man who had never been told no in his entire life. The banker's eyes immediately went to the safe in the corner, then to the land deeds hanging framed on the wall, calculating Harrison's worth down to the last acre. "Caldwell," Ashford boomed, extending a hand that felt like a business transaction. "You're looking prosperous as ever. I trust the cattle market has been kind to you this season?" "Kind enough," Harrison replied carefully, already feeling trapped by their presence in his own home. Victoria launched into a detailed account of Denver society gossip, while her father examined Harrison's books and papers with barely concealed interest. They spoke of people Harrison had never met, parties he had never attended, and a world that felt as foreign to him as the surface of the moon. All the while, Harrison found himself listening for the soft sound of Catherine's footsteps in the hallway, hoping for just a glimpse of her gentle face. "Now then," Ashford said suddenly, settling his considerable bulk into Harrison's favorite reading chair, "let's discuss the real reason we're here. The merger between your ranch operations and my banking interests could make us all very wealthy indeed. Very wealthy." Victoria clapped her hands together like an excited child. "And the best part, darling, is that once we're married, we'll have the most marvelous life together. I've already spoken with Mother about the wedding we're thinking next spring, with guests coming from as far away as San Francisco." The word "married" hit Harrison like a physical blow. He had never actually proposed to Victoria, had never even hinted at marriage, yet somehow it had become an assumed fact in everyone's mind except his own. The walls of the study seemed to be closing in around him, and he loosened his collar, suddenly finding it hard to breathe. "Of course," Victoria continued, lowering her voice conspiratorially, "we'll need to make some changes around here. The household staff, for instance, they're terribly unsuitable for a family of our standing, especially that plain little maid girl. We simply cannot have such common people working in our home." Harrison's blood turned to ice water. "Her name is Catherine, is it?" Victoria waved a dismissive hand. "Well, whatever her name is, she'll have to go. I've already spoken to her this morning, in fact, and made it quite clear that her services will no longer be required once I take over as mistress of this house." The room went deadly silent, except for the crackling of the fire in the grate. Harrison stared at Victoria as if seeing her clearly for the first time, noting the cruel curl of her perfect lips and the calculating gleam in her beautiful eyes. This was the woman his neighbors expected him to marry, the woman who would secure his place in Denver society and increase his wealth beyond imagining. This was also the woman who had just crushed Catherine's gentle heart without a second thought. "You spoke to Catherine?" Harrison's voice came out dangerously quiet. Well, of course I did. Someone had to set the proper boundaries. The poor thing was getting far too comfortable, acting as if she belonged in the main part of the house instead of keeping to the servants' quarters where she belongs. I simply explained the natural order of things to her. Ashford nodded approvingly. Victoria has excellent instincts about managing household staff. It's one of the many qualities that will make her such an asset as your wife. Caldwell. Harrison rose from his chair so abruptly that both Ashfords looked startled. Every muscle in his body was coiled tight with rage, and his hands were clenched into fists at his sides. For 3 months, he had watched Catherine move through his house like a shadow, never asking for anything, never presuming to take up space she hadn't been given. And now this woman, who had been in his home for less than 2 hours, had taken it upon herself to destroy the one person who had brought light back into his dark world. "Excuse me," he said through gritted teeth. "I need some air." He strode from the room before either of them could respond, leaving Victoria calling his name in a voice that had suddenly lost all its sweetness. The last thing he heard as the door slammed behind him was Ashford's voice, calm and confident. "Don't worry, my dear. He's just feeling the natural nervousness of a man about to be married. He'll come around." But as Harrison stood on his front porch, breathing in the sharp November air and watching the sun sink toward the western mountains, he knew that some things, once broken, could never be put back together again. And somewhere in his house, Catherine was packing her few belongings, with tears streaming down her face, believing herself dismissed and unwanted. The worst part was that until this moment, she might have been right. The barn felt like a cathedral in the pre-dawn darkness, filled with the quiet sounds of horses shifting in their stalls and hay rustling under restless hooves. Harrison had been there since 3 in the morning, unable to sleep, mucking stalls that didn't need mucking and checking on animals that were perfectly fine. Anything to avoid going back to the house where Victoria's laughter echoed through rooms that had been peaceful just yesterday. A soft sound made him turn, and his heart nearly stopped when he saw Catherine standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the gray morning sky. She wore her traveling dress, the plain brown wool she had arrived in 3 months ago, and carried the same battered carpet bag that had held all her worldly possessions. Her face was pale as milk, and her eyes were red-rimmed from crying, though she held her chin up with a dignity that made Harrison's chest ache. "I wanted to say goodbye," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to spill over, "and to thank you for giving me a place here, even if it was only for a little while." Harrison set down the pitchfork he had been gripping like a weapon and took a step toward her, but she immediately stepped back, shaking her head. "Please don't make this harder than it already is," she whispered. "Miss Ashford made it very clear that there's no place for me in your new life. And she's right. I always knew this was temporary. I let myself forget for a while. Catherine, listen to me." "No." The word came out sharper than she had intended, and she pressed her hand to her mouth in shock at her own boldness. "I'm sorry, Mr. Caldwell. I didn't mean to raise my voice, but I can't listen to you try to be kind right now. It will only make leaving harder." She turned to go, but Harrison's voice stopped her. "I know you talked to me." Catherine froze, her hand still gripping the barn door. "What?" "When you thought I was sleeping in the study. I know you told me about your mother, about the farm in Ohio, about how the cottonwoods remind you of home. I know you worried about the old mare and talked about laughter being like medicine." The color drained from Catherine's face as she slowly turned back to face him. "You were awake?" "Not always, but often enough." Harrison took another step forward, and this time she didn't back away. "I know you covered me with a quilt during the blizzard. I know you took off my boots and warmed my feet with your own hands when I was half frozen. I know you did it not because it was your job, but because you have the kindest heart I've ever encountered." Catherine's carpet bag slipped from her nerveless fingers and hit the barn floor with a soft thud. "How long?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Weeks. Maybe a month. Harrison ran a hand through his hair, suddenly feeling like the worst kind of fool. At first, I was just curious about you. You moved so quietly, worked so carefully, never asked for anything or complained about anything. I wondered what kind of person you really were when you thought no one was watching. And what did you discover? The question was sharp, with hurt and embarrassment. That you're the most genuine person I've ever met. That you see beauty in ordinary things like autumn leaves and old horses. That you have the courage to care for others even when caring hurts. That you talk to sleeping men as if their souls might hear you, even when you think they never will. Catherine wrapped her arms around herself as if trying to hold herself together. You let me make a fool of myself. Night after night, pouring out my heart to someone who was just listening for entertainment. No. Harrison closed the distance between them in 3 quick strides, and this time, when she tried to back away, he caught her gently by the shoulders. It wasn't entertainment, Catherine. It was the best part of my day. Those conversations, one-sided as they were, reminded me that there was still goodness in the world, still people who could look at a man like me and see something worth caring about. A man like you? Catherine's laugh was bitter as winter wind. You mean a wealthy, successful rancher who owns half the county? What exactly is wrong with a man like that? A man who let his wife and son die while he was away on business. A man who came home to find them buried and cold, who spent 3 years wishing he had died with them. A man so eaten up with guilt and grief that he forgot how to live until a gentle woman started talking to him in the dark about cottonwood trees and her mother's wisdom. The words hung in the air between them like a bridge neither was sure they dared to cross. Catherine's eyes filled with tears, but not the bitter tears of hurt pride. These were soft with understanding and sorrow for pain she had never guessed at. The daguerreotype, she said suddenly. The woman and little boy, they were your family. Harrison nodded, unable to speak past the knot in his throat. And you've been carrying that guilt alone all this time. Another nod. Catherine reached up and touched his face with fingertips that trembled like butterfly wings. Harrison, she said, using his first name for only the second time. Their deaths weren't your fault. You don't know that. I know that fever takes who it takes, regardless of who's holding vigil. I know that a man who feels such deep guilt over losing his family is a man who loved them beyond measure. And I know that Mary, that was her name, wasn't it? Mary would never want you to stop living because she couldn't. Harrison caught her hand in both of his, holding it against his cheek as if it were the most precious thing in the world. How do you know all that? Because I've been watching you too, Harrison Caldwell. Not just when you were sleeping, but during the day when you thought no one was paying attention. I've seen how gentle you are with hurt animals, how patient you are with the newer ranch hands, how you stand at your bedroom window sometimes and look toward the cemetery on the hill with such longing it breaks my heart. The barn was growing lighter now, dawn creeping in through the gaps between the boards, but neither of them moved. They stood there in the golden dust motes, hands joined, hearts finally speaking the truths they had been too afraid to voice. Victoria Ashford is a beautiful woman, Catherine said eventually. She's everything a successful man should want in a wife. She'll give you position in society, connections in Denver, a future that makes sense to everyone who knows you. And what will she give my heart? Harrison asked quietly. Catherine's smile was sad and knowing. Nothing it wants, I suspect. But hearts want foolish things sometimes. They want autumn leaves and gentle words in the dark, and hands that touch with kindness rather than calculation. They want to matter to someone, not for what they own or what they can provide, but for who they are when all the pretense is stripped away. Catherine Morrison, Harrison said, bringing her hand to his lips and pressing a soft kiss to her palm. Will you help me be foolish? Before she could answer, the barn door swung open with a crash that made them both jump apart. Victoria Ashford stood framed in the doorway, her perfect face twisted with rage, and her emerald dress incongruous against the rustic backdrop of hay and horse stalls. Well, she said, her voice dripping with venom. "Isn't this a cozy little scene? No wonder you've been so distracted, Harrison. You've been playing master and servant with the help." The cruel words hit their target with devastating accuracy, and Harrison felt Catherine flinch as if she had been struck. But before he could respond, Catherine stepped forward, her chin raised and her eyes blazing with a fire he had never seen before. "You're right, Miss Ashford," she said clearly. "I am the help. I clean floors and wash dishes and darn socks, and I'm proud of every honest day's work I've done in my life. But I've never had to buy a man's attention with my father's money, and I've never had to tear down another woman to make myself feel bigger." Victoria's mouth fell open in shock, but Catherine wasn't finished. "Mr. Caldwell is a good man who deserves better than a wife who sees him as nothing more than a business transaction. He deserves someone who loves the sound of his laughter, who notices when he's tired, who cares about his heart instead of his bank account. If that someone isn't you, Miss Ashford, then perhaps you should consider whether you're the one who doesn't belong here." And with that, Catherine Morrison, who had spent her entire life making herself small and invisible, picked up her carpetbag and walked past Victoria Ashford and out of the barn, leaving two stunned people in her wake, and proving that sometimes the quietest hearts beat with the fiercest courage of all. Catherine's hands shook as she threw her few dresses into the old carpetbag, each piece of clothing landing with a soft thud that seemed to echo her racing heartbeat. The small room above the kitchen had never felt so cramped, the walls pressing in like they wanted to squeeze the breath right out of her lungs. "You've been listening to my private thoughts," she whispered to herself, repeating the words that had tumbled out by the river just an hour ago. The shame burned in her chest like she'd swallowed hot coals. Every night for months, she had poured her heart out to what she thought was a sleeping man, sharing memories of her mother, her fears, her secret dreams she'd never told another living soul. A soft knock at the door made her freeze. "Catherine?" Harrison's voice came through the thin wood, gentle but insistent. "Please, let me explain." "Go away," she called back, surprised by how steady her voice sounded when everything inside her felt like it was breaking apart. She grabbed her mother's prayer book from the nightstand, the leather cover worn smooth from years of handling. This book had traveled with her from Ohio to Wyoming, through good times and bad, and now it would have to carry her somewhere else entirely. "I know you're angry," Harrison said, and she could hear him leaning against the door. "You have every right to be, but please, just listen for 1 minute." Catherine pressed her lips together tight. She'd done enough listening for one lifetime. All those evenings when she dusted his books and straightened his papers, thinking he was peacefully asleep in his big leather chair. She'd felt safe talking to him then, like she was sharing secrets with a trusted friend who couldn't judge her for being just a poor girl from a failed farm. But he'd been awake, listening, watching, probably thinking she was foolish or pathetic or both. "I never meant to hurt you," Harrison's voice continued through the door. "I started pretending to sleep because I was curious, but then I kept doing it, because those conversations were the best part of my day." Catherine's hands stilled on the carpetbag. "The best part of his day?" She shook her head hard, trying to clear away the tiny spark of hope that wanted to flicker to life in her chest. Rich men like Harrison Caldwell didn't find conversations with housekeepers to be the best part of anything. "You were lying to me," she said, finally opening the door to face him. Harrison stood in the narrow hallway, his hat in his hands, looking more uncertain than she'd ever seen him. "Every single night, you were lying." "Yes," he said simply, "I was. And I'm sorrier about that than I can possibly say." The honest admission caught Catherine off guard. She'd expected him to make excuses or try to explain it away, but instead he just stood there looking miserable and guilty and somehow smaller than usual. "Miss Ashford is downstairs waiting for you," Catherine said, stepping back into her room to continue packing. "You should go to her. She's everything a man like you should want." "But she's not what I want." The words were so quiet Catherine almost didn't hear them. She turned around, clutching her mother's prayer book against her chest like a shield. "What did you say?" Harrison stepped into the doorway, careful not to come any closer. Victoria Ashford is beautiful and educated and from a fine family. She'd make a suitable wife for Harrison Caldwell, the rancher, the businessman, the man everyone expects me to be. He paused, running a hand through his dark hair. "But she's not what Harrison the man wants. She's not you." Catherine's heart hammered so hard she was sure he could hear it. "You don't know what you're saying." "I know exactly what I'm saying. For 3 years after Mary and James died, I felt like I was walking around dead inside. Nothing mattered. Nothing brought me joy. I went through the motions of living, but I wasn't really alive." His brown eyes locked onto hers. "Then you came here, and slowly, night by night, listening to you talk about golden leaves and stubborn horses, and your mother's sayings, you brought me back to life." Tears started to blur Catherine's vision, but she blinked them back hard. She couldn't afford to be weak now, not when her whole future hung in the balance. "Pretty words don't change the facts, Mr. Day. Caldwell. I'm a housekeeper from Ohio, whose father died owing money to half the county. You're one of the richest men in Wyoming Territory. People like us don't belong together." "Maybe they don't in the world's eyes," Harrison said, taking one careful step into the room. "But I don't care about the world anymore. I only care about you." Before Catherine could respond, the sound of footsteps on the stairs made them both turn. Victoria Ashford appeared at the top of the narrow staircase, her silk dress rustling with each step, her face arranged in a smile that didn't reach her cold blue eyes. "How cozy," Victoria said, looking from Harrison to Catherine and back again. "Harrison, darling, your housekeeper seems to be having some sort of emotional episode. Perhaps she should take a few days to compose herself." Catherine felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. Here she was, crying and disheveled in her plain cotton dress, while Victoria looked like she'd stepped out of a fashion magazine from back east. The contrast between them couldn't have been clearer. "Victoria," Harrison said carefully, "Catherine isn't having an episode. We were just talking." "About what, exactly?" Victoria's tone was light, but her eyes were sharp as broken glass. "Surely household matters can wait until a more appropriate time." The dismissive way Victoria spoke about her, like she was a piece of furniture that could be moved around at will, made something snap inside Catherine's chest. She'd spent her whole life being dismissed, overlooked, treated like she didn't matter. But hearing it now, in front of Harrison, felt like being slapped. "We were talking about private matters," Catherine said, lifting her chin. "Between friends." Victoria's laugh was like ice cracking. "Friends? Oh, my dear girl, how wonderfully naive. Men like Harrison don't have friendships with the help. They have arrangements." The ugly implication in Victoria's words hit Catherine like a physical blow. She saw Harrison's face go dark with anger, saw him take a step toward Victoria, but the damage was already done. Every insecurity Catherine had ever felt about her place in the world came flooding back. "Get out," Catherine said quietly. "I beg your pardon?" Victoria's eyebrows rose. "I said, get out." Catherine's voice grew stronger. "Both of you. This is my room until I leave tomorrow, and I want you both out of it right now." Harrison looked like he wanted to argue, but something in Catherine's expression must have warned him off. He gave Victoria a look that could have frozen the river solid. "You heard her. Let's go." As their footsteps faded down the stairs, Catherine sank onto her narrow bed and finally let the tears come. Tomorrow she would leave Wyoming Territory forever, and tonight might be the last time she ever saw Harrison Caldwell. The man who had listened to her secrets, who claimed she'd brought him back to life, who stood between two worlds and couldn't seem to figure out which one he truly belonged to. But what Victoria had said kept echoing in her mind. Men like Harrison don't have friendships with the help. Maybe she was right. Maybe Catherine had been fooling herself all along, reading meaning into kindness that was never really there. Outside her window, snow began to fall again, each flake catching the lamplight like tiny stars. Catherine watched them drift past and tried not to think about how much she would miss this place, this man, this brief moment when she'd allowed herself to believe she might actually matter to someone. The question that would haunt her through the long night ahead was simple but devastating. Had Harrison's feelings been real? Or had she simply been another arrangement, another convenience in the complicated life of a wealthy man who could afford to play with hearts the way other people played with money? The grandfather clock in the main hallway chimed midnight as Harrison paced the length of his study, his boots wearing a path in the Persian rug his late wife had chosen 7 years ago in Denver. Victoria had finally retired to the guest room after an evening of increasingly tense conversation, but sleep felt impossible with Catherine planning to leave at first light. He'd made his choice hours ago, but now came the hard part, convincing the woman he loved that his choice was real. The soft creak of floorboards above his head told him Catherine was still awake too, probably staring at the ceiling and counting down the hours until she could escape this whole mess. Harrison had seen the look in her eyes after Victoria's cruel words about arrangements and the help. It was the look of someone who'd been hurt so many times that kindness felt like just another trap, waiting to spring. A gentle knock at the study door interrupted his brooding. "Come in," he called, expecting Cookie with another pot of coffee to fuel his sleepless night. Instead, Catherine stepped into the room, still dressed but with her hair loose around her shoulders, carrying something wrapped in brown paper under her arm. She looked nervous but determined, like someone who'd made up her mind about something important. "I thought you were asleep," Harrison said, then immediately wished he could take the words back. After everything that had happened, mentioning sleep was probably the worst possible choice. "I couldn't sleep," Catherine said simply. "Too much thinking." She held out the brown package. "I wanted to give you this before I go. It's not much, but..." Harrison took the package with careful hands, feeling the weight of something solid inside. When he unwrapped it, his breath caught in his throat. It was a small wooden carving of a horse, carved with such delicate skill that he could see the individual muscles and the flowing mane. The wood was polished to a warm, golden glow. "You made this?" he asked, running his finger along the smooth surface. Catherine nodded, a slight blush coloring her cheeks. "My father taught me wood carving before he died. I've been working on it in the evenings after my chores were done. It's supposed to be thunder, that bay stallion you're so proud of." Harrison looked closer and realized she was right. She'd captured not just any horse, but his prize stallion, complete with the distinctive white marking on Thunder's forehead and the way he held his head high when he ran. The attention to detail was extraordinary. "Catherine, this is beautiful. You're an artist." She ducked her head, embarrassed by the praise. "It's just whittling, nothing fancy." "Nothing fancy?" Harrison turned the carving over in his hands, marveling at the craftsmanship. "This would sell for good money in Denver or San Francisco. You have real talent." "Talent doesn't put food on the table," Catherine said with a sad smile. "That's what my mother always said. Dreams are pretty, Catherine, but dreams don't pay debts." Harrison set the carving carefully on his desk, right next to the daguerreotype of his late family. The two objects looked right together somehow. The past and the present, memory and hope, side by side. "Your mother was wrong," he said quietly. "Dreams do pay debts, just not always the kind that can be counted in dollars and cents." Catherine was quiet for a long moment, staring at the carving on his desk. "I heard you and Miss Ashford talking after dinner," she finally said. "She's very beautiful, very refined. She knows how to be a proper rancher's wife." "Yes, she does," Harrison agreed. "Victoria knows exactly how to manage a household and host dinner parties and make conversation with important people. She'd never embarrass me in public or say the wrong thing to business associates." Catherine's face fell slightly. "Then you should marry her. She's perfect for you." "She is perfect for the man everyone expects me to be," Harrison said, moving closer. "But she's not perfect for the man I actually am, the man I want to be." "I don't understand." Harrison picked up the wooden horse again, feeling its perfect weight in his palm. Victoria looks at this ranch and sees a business empire. She sees cattle and land and profit margins. When she looks at me, she sees a successful rancher who can give her the life she was raised to expect. He paused, meeting Catherine's eyes. But when you look at Thunder, you see something worth carving. When you look at me, what do you see? Catherine's voice was barely a whisper. I see a man who loved his family so much that losing them nearly broke him. I see someone who works hard and treats his animals with kindness and pays his workers fairly, even when other ranchers don't. I see. She stopped, swallowing hard. What else do you see? I see a man who's lonelier than he wants to admit, who sits in his chair at night and listens to the house settle around him, wishing he had someone to talk to about more than cattle prices and land deals. Tears started to slide down her cheeks. I see someone who deserves better than a housekeeper, who falls in love with him while he's pretending to sleep. Harrison's heart clenched at the pain in her voice. He reached out to wipe away her tears with gentle fingers. You're right about almost everything, he said softly. Except one thing. What? I don't deserve better than you, Catherine. I don't deserve someone who sees past the money and the land to the man underneath. I don't deserve someone who carves wooden horses just to make me smile, or someone who takes care of me when I'm too stubborn to take care of myself. He cupped her face in both hands. But I'm hoping you might love me enough to let me try to deserve you anyway. Harrison. Catherine's voice broke on his name. I sent Victoria back to Denver this afternoon, Harrison continued. Told her father the business deal was off and the engagement was never going to happen. She called me 7 kinds of fool, and maybe she's right. But I'd rather be a fool who loves you than a rich man who marries for convenience. Catherine stared at him, hope and disbelief warring in her expression. People will talk. They'll say terrible things about both of us. Let them talk. I've been living my life according to what other people expect for too long. It nearly killed everything good in me. Harrison's thumbs brushed away her tears. You brought me back to life, Catherine. You made me remember what it feels like to hope for something more than just getting through another day. But I'm nobody special. I'm just a farm girl from Ohio who knows how to dust furniture and cook simple meals. You're the woman who saw a lonely man in a chair and talked to him like he mattered. You're the woman who took care of me during a blizzard without expecting anything in return. You're the woman who makes me want to be better than I am. Harrison's voice grew stronger, more certain. You're not nobody, Catherine Morrison. You're everything. The snow outside had picked up, swirling past the windows in thick white curtains that made the warm study feel like the only safe place in the world. Catherine looked from Harrison's face to the wooden horse on his desk, then back to his face. If I stay, she said carefully, if this is real, what happens next? Next, we get married as soon as the preacher can make it through the snow. Next, you never have to clean another person's house unless it's because you want to keep our house tidy. Next, you set up a workshop where you can carve as many wooden animals as your heart desires, and we'll sell them in Denver or keep them all, whatever makes you happy. Catherine's smile was like sunrise after the longest night. And after that, we build a life together. A real life, with laughter and arguments and quiet evenings by the fire. We'll have children if we're blessed with them. And we'll teach them that love matters more than money, that kindness matters more than status. Harrison pulled her close, feeling her warmth against his chest. We'll prove that sometimes the best things in life come not from careful planning, but from having the courage to follow your heart, even when it leads you somewhere unexpected. Catherine rose up on her toes and kissed him, soft and sweet and full of promise. When they broke apart, she was crying again, but these were tears of joy instead of sorrow. Yes, she whispered against his lips. Yes, to all of it. Outside, the Wyoming wind howled across the plains, but inside the warm study, 2 hearts that had been alone too long finally found their way home to each other. The wooden horse watched over them from the desk, a small testament to the truth that love, real love, could be carved from the simplest materials and polished to a shine that would last forever. And if the people of the territory talked, as people always do, Harrison and Catherine Caldwell were too busy building their new life together to pay much attention to the opinions of those who had never learned that the greatest wealth wasn't found in bank accounts or land deeds, but in the simple courage to love and be loved in return.